Again, my name is Ronny Sandoval. I'm with a group called Regulatory Assistance Project. So this is a group that provides technical assistance to regulators and other key decision makers on emerging energy issues. And today I will be covering a topic around recovering and allocating costs associated with the investments that we've all been discussing for most of the day. So I think this is a really important topic in essentially thinking through how these investments that we're proposing to pursue over the coming decades could be covered in terms of costs, what are the revenue sources, and I think it's critical in setting the pace and the scale of the investments that we're likely to see. Luckily, there are a number of different funding streams, processes available today that, if pulled together, can help essentially result in more strategic investments that advances a number of complementary outcomes. So in terms of a preview of what I'll be talking about today, I'll start with a little bit of level setting on some cost recovery and cost allocation concepts, follow up by the discussion of regulatory challenges associated with advancing these investments. Next, I'll take a look at some of the opportunities to make proactive investments associated with the distribution system and distributed energy resources in particular. And I'll follow that with a discussion of some potential sources of funding that we should keep in mind in thinking through how to advance these investments in a cost-effective and complementary way. And lastly, I'll end with a bit of a preview of what you're likely to hear tomorrow regarding resilience investments and how that ties into the cost allocation discussion that we'll cover today. So I'd like to begin with this quote here on allocating costs. I actually don't know how many of you are familiar with the slide rule, but in essence, what we're trying to get there is essentially the process for developing a cost allocation, cost recovery. It only gets you so far if you are looking at it as sort of a calculation, a cost-effectiveness exercises. There's a fair bit of judgment that is involved, decision-making, prioritization that goes beyond simple calculation. So things like customer affordability, economic development, certain priorities are sort of layered into the cost allocation process, and it's important to recognize that you're not just going to get a correct answer for the cost allocation, that there's a fair bit of judgment involved in prioritization. So in terms of the process for developing rate making and cost allocation, we generally start with a revenue requirement, which is an element that reflects the cost that should be collected, that must be collected to cover things like capital investments, operation and maintenance. In the case of investor-owned utilities, it can involve the rate of return, of course, and things like taxes that ultimately someone has to pay for. And that's sort of what you see here in this big green circle up top. Next, we conduct an exercise called functionalization, where we allocate those revenue requirements, those costs that we identify, into these broad categories of generation, transmission, distribution, and billing and customer services. Later on, we go through a process of classification in which we try to assign those costs a little bit further and try to determine, do these costs vary by the number of customers that we have? Does it vary by peak demand? Does it vary, like fuel costs, does it vary by how much you consume over a period of time? It's a way of sort of trying to structure and categorize these different costs in a way that allows us to develop the most appropriate rate designs to help get to a fair and equitable way of recovering these costs. And lastly, these costs are then brought down to the different customer classes, that allocation: residential, commercial, industrial, and street lighting. I'll skip this for the benefit of time, but you all can see it as another view of what I just showed. But I think maybe the last thing that I would call out is this section over here in the bottom, where we talk about the retail rates, the design of those rates. So you can see how every one of those exercises above results in the potential for different components to be set on how you would recover those rates. So some things like metering, you pay a fixed number of dollars a month. That meter continues to, has to be read on a monthly basis. But then there's some costs that are recovered, like fuel costs, as I mentioned, or peak capacity that are met through, met best or better through other ways of recovering costs, including a per kWh charge or a potential per kW charge. Any questions on that general process before I jump into some of the challenges? Great. I'll take that. So in terms of cost allocation and the challenges associated with it, even before we talk about distribution system investments, again, I talked about this balancing act that needs to happen between that recognizes the type of rate designs that we introduce, plus the priorities that we're looking to advance, including maybe creating some safeguards for income-eligible customers to continue to maintain energy services. But there are also some trade-offs that should be considered in how complex or simple we sort of make the rate design options available for customers. So simple rate designs are great, they're easy to understand, but they may not necessarily drive the sort of action that you would like from customers in order to conserve or adopt certain technologies or take other actions that may be beneficial to the grid. More complex options, standalone, could be very onerous for folks to take on or take advantage of if they don't have potentially some technologies that can help automate that response or are difficult to understand. So ultimately, what customers or regulators need to do is balance some of those priorities with the options that are rolled out in a way that drives the intended response. And specific to distributed energy resources and some of the capabilities that we discussed already, DERs can potentially increase or decrease the system cost depending on where they're sited, the type of technologies that are rolled out, whether or not there are complementary measures like time of use rates that can better optimize when they're deployed. There are additional challenges when you consider the fact that demand and supply of energy at the distributed level is going to be more dynamic than it has been in the past. One way to potentially get ahead of this, you may have heard of this already, but essentially making proactive investments that are more thoughtful, that anticipate where hosting capacity limits are being reached and where you would like more of those resources to be deployed, and essentially ensuring that you're taking actions before the need is immediate and there's a long sort of lead time before an adequate solution can be put in place. And these proactive distribution upgrades have a few different flavors in which I bucket them here. So some of these, especially that first bucket, is essentially addressing how do we maintain reliability, knowing that these changes are coming in how customers are consuming and generating electricity. How do you just maintain the level of reliability that we are used to? And that could be by deploying energy storage, more additional controls, visibility, things that help you get greater awareness and helps you ride through some of these potential variable challenges. The next is potentially not just managing or maintaining reliability, but can you be proactive in potentially coordinating the response of some of those distributed energy resources in a way that allows you to optimize the best time of the day in which those resources can contribute to meeting, relieving peak demand, relieving congestion, and essentially working in concert with the grid to help mitigate costs and maintain reliability. And the last is, again, this support for hosting capacity expansion, creating greater opportunities for these distributed energy resources. We know electrification is coming in various regions. We know that customers are adopting distributed energy resources that provide supply. Can we anticipate that, get ahead of it, before customers are potentially turned away, before efforts that could be actually beneficial to the grid are essentially cut off because we're not necessarily making the investments to support their contribution. So again, who pays for all these investments? So one of the things I encourage all of you to take a look at is the fact that ratepayers alone don't necessarily have to be the only ones that bear the costs associated with this. There are potential public sources. There are a number of customers that can sort of leverage their own private dollars to, again, work in concert and recognizing that some of these investments need to be made. How can we ensure that all these funding sources are moving in a complementary way, that there's transparency in the need and in the potential best fit approaches to, let's say, enhancing resilience. I'll keep this one brief, but the long and short of it here is that you can go after every single federal opportunity that may be out there. This extends to the state level as well. So it is important to ensure that one is able to identify those high value opportunities, make sure that essentially you have a way of managing the risks associated with the deployment of some of those technologies. Do you have a way, are you familiar with the requirements associated with the federal, other state opportunities for funding, so that you go after only the things that rise to the top that are the most beneficial for your constituents. I'll have a couple of slides here on the types of projects that have been able to secure federal funding. I won't go through the extensive list. You can all take a look at that and maybe ask questions later if you're interested in hearing more about some of these projects. But if you think about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, the types of technologies that were pursued at that were centered around, or the projects were centered around smart grid deployments, essentially they were centered around the technologies, less than the capabilities, less than some of the objectives that we're seeing across the, just over the last couple of years with IIJA and the like. As you can see, in terms of the federal cost share, they are significant. Often you're getting sort of a 50 match when it comes to paying for some of these deployments. And essentially what this indicates is that there's some projects that may not have penciled out, that you may not have received commission approval without that federal match. These are projects that perhaps folks have been contemplating, thinking about for some period of time, and then when these federal opportunities arose, they were able to take advantage of it because they were ready with essentially a pretty firmed up project and approach. But the types of technologies that you saw during the ARA period were more around visibility and control, creating time of use capabilities. They were very much looking at what can these technologies potentially help advance. But with the grid resilience and some of the IIJA funding opportunities, you see more of a focus on advancing capabilities, addressing specific hazards like wildfires in a way that is more centered around what is it that we need out of our energy system, and ultimately what portfolio of solutions, it's not just smart meters, but what portfolio of solutions can we pull together to help best meet those needs. So you see that the scale of the federal awards, at least per project, I know there's a lot more funding this time around, but the scale of it, what folks receive, is still comparable, but it's still significant in helping advance some of these, these priorities. And you can see there's a number of wildfire mitigation projects identified here. Pause there, real quick. Any quick reactions, questions? Happy to power through. So this is the very simple, non-confrontational, straightforward process for cost recovery of grid investments. I think I mentioned this the last time, just be very skeptical of something that's this clean and orderly when it comes to this topic. So generally, let me just walk you through the general process, and then I'll walk you through this specific example that hopefully helps bring the topic to life. So first, as I mentioned, ideally, you have a company or someone, an applicant, that has developed a project, has been thinking about it for a period of time, and is fleshed out enough that they can really put it together and put it for consideration for an award. At a subsequent time, or maybe before they ultimately file with the award agency, the applicant or the company could essentially file an application with the commission, essentially requesting approval for the project. And this is not necessarily involved, commitment of funds. This is more of, this is the vision that we have for the project. We have an intention of filing this application before whatever agency, it may be DOE, DOT, but this is the project that we have in mind. The commission evaluates this project and then issues an order potentially saying, we are essentially, we approve moving forward with this project on the condition that the company receives a certain level of award, a significant award. They may specify a dollar amount, but essentially, if you get the award, we're comfortable enough of moving forward to essentially commit to, we agree with the direction of the project. Once that application comes back with essentially the conditions under which the grant is essentially approved, the company files potentially an updated filing that spells out those additional conditions, and essentially at that point, subject to the terms that the commission has set, the commission then might provide essentially the method in which those costs are going to be recovered, essentially approval for the commitment for the company to, essentially for a commitment to, it's an order to commit funds from ratepayers. I ended up with like a double adjective there. So ideally, you have a project in place or something you've been thinking about, this opportunity comes along, and the commission has an opportunity to vet the project as it goes along and make a final determination after they hear more details about the obligations, the nature of what the company needs to do to secure that fund allocation. So this is a very similar process that Central Maine Power underwent shortly, in a very short period. You can see it's from June 2008 to February 2020, in which a commission order was ultimately provided. Did I say February 2010? 10. It is 10. So maybe spending a little bit of time on this first bullet here. 2008, there was an order issued by the commission to Central Maine Power. Essentially, the company had been considering the deployment of smart meters for a period of time. They found in June 2008 that they didn't have enough, the commission felt they didn't have enough information on the costs and essentially the benefit cost analysis to make a decision at this point, but they deferred a decision for a future period. So this is something that had been discussed with a number of different stakeholders for a period of time. So this has been vetted, discussed to some extent, but ultimately a decision was deferred. And then, less than a year later, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was enacted. It was then, there were these discrete opportunities to essentially file for projects meeting the exact same nature that Central Maine Power was contemplating with AMI, and following a series of additional communications with stakeholders about the nature of the opportunity that this law presented, and then ultimately a back and forth in developing this application, Central Maine Power was ultimately able to put together an application that was compelling enough to get essentially a 50-50 match in terms of federal funding contributions to deploy smart meters and then ultimately reduce the cost that customers, ratepayers, taxpayers are covering it, but ratepayers would have to cover in order to realize the capabilities of this AMI project. There was some contention, right? And you sort of have to allow for that. And if this project wasn't necessarily vetted to the extent that it had been, it may not have been sort of put in place in time to respond by the timelines that were set by DOE here. And just some quick thoughts to think about. I just have I'm going to focus on the bullet points here at the top, the ones that are bolded. So again, this is a great opportunity for customers, ratepayers to potentially exhibit lower costs associated with some of these deployments if you're able to pull in resources from federal, state, private sources. There is a potential that, again, because the company is only contributing 50% of the cost, they may only get, again, essentially a rate of return on that 50% and not the full 100%. But the important thing to recognize there as well is that that project may not have moved forward at all if that federal funding wasn't there. So that rate of return could have been on a zero value as opposed to 50% or 100 or so million that the company essentially was committing in terms of ratepayer dollars. And again, in terms of aligning sort of these pools of funding, if the federal government, private entities, if ratepayers see the value in these investments in a coordinated manner, then you're able to pull these resources in a way that's complementary, that it's not sort of disparate projects that may not necessarily move in the same direction. You avoid some of that misalignment and potentially redundancy or overbuilding when it comes to pursuing some of these investments. I'll keep this very quick. I have a number of case studies and examples that we can, that you all can look at towards the end. I tried to identify, based on that discussion that we had earlier about functionalization, classification, and allocation, how each one of these projects essentially, fit within those categories. And, each of these, in essence, has a different pool of funding that have been mobilized in order to advance resiliency and expand the capabilities of the grid. So CenterPoint Energy was one of those awardees that I mentioned at the beginning that received ARA funding, I think in 2008 or so. which was right before the RO was enacted, uh, uh, essentially the territory was impacted by Hurricane Ike. So they had sort of fresh in their mind the types of hazards and uses for smart grid funding, and they focused on expanding their capabilities in terms of visibility and control of the grid to help reduce outage duration and just get customers back in service that do lose power. By 2017, you all may remember Hurricane Harvey. There was historic rainfalls in the Texas and Louisiana area, and that distribution automation that was put in place after the Hurricane Ike and the use of ARA funds was able to avoid 41 million outage minutes for their customers. Essentially, there was a number of customers that were able to keep power that otherwise would have lost it had those technologies not been deployed. It didn't avoid all outages. It was a solution, a portion of a broader resilience strategy, but this demonstrates how thoughtful, timely investments can help, right, potentially mitigate the impact of future outages. There are a number of examples, like that, but I think you'll hear maybe more tomorrow about metrics, different ways of measuring the effectiveness of some of these investments, but it did perform admirably during this outages. This is another example in which a New Jersey Energy Resilience Bank was established using essentially federal funds associated with disaster recovery after Hurricane Sandy. So this is it's not ratepayer funds. These were federal funds for disaster recovery that were used to essentially jumpstart a energy resilience bank, essentially providing seed funding that allowed the continual disbursements of grants and loans to enhance resilience across critical services. So again, not ratepayer funds, like maybe the case in other places. Xcel Energy in Wisconsin rolled out a energy resilience as a service pilot, which in essence, they had a number of different commercial and industrial customers that were interested in having greater reliability, greater resilience during some of those very disruptive events. And rather than sort of requesting that ratepayers in general, the broad ratepays, contribute to the investments, what they were looking for is essentially the company to serve as a partner, as a trusted advisor in helping them think through what are the options that we should consider when pursuing enhanced resilience. And the way that the program works is that the company makes the investments up front, and through a recurring payment over a period of 10 years, those costs are ultimately paid for by that small segment of customers that are seeking the enhanced resilience and not the broader rate base. So this is a way of advancing resilience in a way that is thoughtful, that limits the potential incompatible investments that the customer is seeking, and in a way that is more affordable, more manageable than otherwise would be the case. And this is another mix of ratepayer, private funding to create more resilient solutions, but this time, and not for just commercial and industrial, but residential, small commercial, in a way that is more accessible to the masses. And I've been throwing this word around a lot, the resilience, and you'll hear about this a lot tomorrow. But this is my favorite definition for the term, which is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. So it's not just the ability for you to bounce back, but it's that both the concept of riding through some of these large disruptions and potentially getting the system back quickly enough to potentially meet critical services and then ultimately have full restoration of your standard electric service. So there are a whole host of different hazards, threats that one can plan against. There are earthquakes, wildfires. There are a number of different hazards that some regions hadn't thought about very much over the last 10 years, but now it's more prominent, now it's more top of mind. And that's why you see, some of those awards around wildfire mitigation get such prominence. And again, it's not just utilities that see the value of resilience. It's not like reliability, which is essentially the upkeep of the existing grid for as long as, for as many hours as you can during the, during the course of the year. Everyone sees the human toll, the economic impacts that a resilience event takes on communities, on their private business. Everyone feels it. So there's, when it comes to resilience, even if the utility isn't taking action, some private companies, private businesses are taking actions to shore up against flooding, put in backup generators, putting additional energy storage or distributed solutions in a way that allows them to potentially minimize the economic losses. Residential customers also, especially if they're vulnerable in their remote areas, they do value the ability to maintain that sort of energy continuity through those large disruptive events. So everyone sort of sees the value of it. And I mention this because there are a whole host of different measures in which you can enhance resilience. Like in the case of Sandoval Energy, we talked about some of that monitoring and control, and in the case of New Jersey and New York, there was a lot of investment in terms of hardening, keeping floodwaters out in order to keep the electrical equipment running as long as it can. But also in Puerto Rico and Hawaii and other places, they're pursuing distributed energy resources as a way of enhancing resilience and keeping, again, if folks are out a month, 11 months, and the grid is going to be out an extended period of time, and the loads are sensitive, the customers are sensitive, that what you need from the grid is sensitive. Many are taking action themselves to expand their options, including the adoption of distributed energy resources. So I'm going to end with this slide. I'm not going to run through it as well, but again, what I tried to do here is just across all of these examples represent a mix of different funding sources, different approaches that were taken to enhance resilience across these regions. And again, it could be a mix of, again, private dollars with federal dollars coming together to enhance resilience. It could be a mix of all three of the sources that I mentioned before. But you can see there's a diversity in the types of solutions that are employed based on who's pursuing that and the hazards that they're looking to address. There are a number of questions for you to ask if you want to just probe a little bit deeper as to the resilience approaches that your jurisdiction has taken on, and also whether or not are there suitable cost-effectiveness approaches that recognize the fact that it doesn't have to be just one entity, Ratepayer, is continuing to pay for some of these costs. If everyone sees the value in advancing some of these objectives like resilience, that you can pull those sources in a way that's complementary and it's not duplicative, again, of some of the potential approaches you could take in the alternative. There are a couple of resources there, but really appreciate your time.